On behalf of the ENMU Department of Music, welcome to another outstanding musical performance. Your consideration for fellow patrons and performers by not causing any distraction that will disturb the atmosphere of the concert will ensure everyone's full enjoyment of the live performance. Should a young patron become unruly, please exit to the music building lobby as soon as possible. Please turn off all electronic devices at this time. Photography and videography are prohibited during performances. Photographs may be taken when the performance has concluded. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here today. I'm going to be discussing graphic scores and their implementation in music therapy. So I hope when you walked in, you grabbed a pamphlet. Those will have all of the information that I'm talking about today, and they include a lot of my visuals as well. So please feel free to keep those and look over them so you could do your own research. So first I'd like to discuss specifically what music therapy even is, because a lot of people don't know. It is a more modern therapy than other therapies you would know of. So, music therapy is the therapeutic implementation of music. So basically, it's music used in a therapeutic way. Sounds pretty cool, right? So, it was first used, as documented as used, in the 1940s by the United States War Department. They saw that a lot of their soldiers were getting really depressed. They were very sad. They were considering suicide. A lot of them were anxious. Wouldn't you be? War was everywhere. They were seeing their friends and their family be slaughtered. They were worried for their country. They were worried if they were going to make it home. So they had to do something about it. So the United States started to recruit musicians, and these musicians would play music for these soldiers, and over time they saw that it really benefited everything about their lives. They weren't so sad, suicide rates dropped drastically, so they continued to use musicians through the First and Second World War. And this helped greatly. It motivated them, it entertained them, and it helped build morale, which brought the whole military closer. So when you are interacting with a music therapist, a lot of things can occur. It could be listening to music, playing music, you could play instruments, you could sing, you could even compose with your music therapist. Only a couple of the areas of effectiveness that we see that music therapy affects is psychological, emotional, physical, spiritual, cognitive, and social. Isn't that pretty much every aspect of your life? You can see psychologically that we see the improvements in the self-regulation specifically. That means that people are using better healthy coping mechanisms for themselves. They're learning how to develop these coping mechanisms. It helps decrease anxiety and depression. It can increase overall motivation for your daily life. Using music therapy as an alternative to pain medications can even be super beneficial, because we do see that there's possible drug abuse. You could become addicted. Long-term abuse or use can lead to liver damage. You can treat that with music therapy instead of drugs, because we see that it can reduce muscle tension, it can increase blood flow, it helps with respiration. There's so many benefits just to using music. But just like any other form of therapy, music therapy is not for everyone, and it may not work for everyone. That is why it often works best when used in conjunction with other therapies, like behavioral therapies or physical therapies. But my favorite part is that it is so versatile. It is so accessible. Music therapy can be practiced in basically any place. That means hospitals, a patient's home, a private practice, prisons. It could happen anywhere. It could also include many patients working with one therapist. That seems very accessible to me. You can do music therapy laying down in your bed. You don't have to stand at all. Or if you need to stand, you can do it while you're moving around the room. If you have a hyperactive patient, they can run around the room and you're still getting the benefits. This makes it super accessible for disabled individuals, individuals that are homebound, individuals with memory issues, or we see specifically people with ASD, or autism spectrum disorder. They've been found to benefit greatly from music therapy. And that's because it's consistent, and it's fun, and it doesn't cause so much anxiety because they aren't thinking about going into therapy and just spewing all of their problems and reliving all of that stress and anxiety. Instead, they're just having a fun activity, listening to music with a friend, hopefully, and their therapist. We see specifically that people with ASD, they increase their communication skills through music therapy, which is huge. It is groundbreaking. That is something specifically that people on the autism spectrum struggle with. We also see that patients like this, patients even with dissociative disorders or patients with maybe bipolar disorder, personality disorders, it makes therapy a lot more accessible for them as well because they aren't, again, focusing on their problems specifically. Instead, it's more coping mechanisms and self-regulation and learning how to handle your emotions. So next, we're going to talk about graphic notation. So graphic notation is otherwise known as graphic or visual scores. It could be called either. This includes music that is represented by visual symbols and textures and different shapes that are different from the traditional musical notation that we see on the staff with our normal notes. It essentially gives the person the ability to describe exactly how they're feeling in a simpler way. So we first see the very first score in about 840 CE by this man here, Aurelian of Riom. He is definitely not my type, but I'm sure he was someone's. So this first rendition of a graphic score was called Musica Discipline, and it was a treatise on music, the music theory that they had available at the time. So that was very cool. Here's an example of Musica Discipline. You can see that it's very not traditional. A normal singer or musician would look at this and say, how do I read that? You expect me to play music with this? Isn't that cool? So then again, in the early 20th century, composers decided that the traditional notation just wasn't enough. They needed something more substantial to show exactly how they were feeling inside. They really wanted to express their full musical thoughts and potential, and they couldn't do that with the strict rules they were given. Then again, we see that post-war composers of the 50s and 60s, they brought about a resurgence of visual scores. They decided, wow, this is way less strict. This is way more accessible. This lets me further show how I really feel when I'm writing music. That's amazing. Carl Bergström Nielsen, he's a very influential music therapist, and he is a professor and a teacher. He says that on a deeper level, creating a notation can serve to clarify the therapist's own perception of the music, its clinical interpretation, and which steps to take next. I think that's an amazing quote by him. It really shows that graphic scores can be used in a therapeutic setting, and we will expand on that just a little later. So these, in a little bit, I'm going to show you some scores. So as you look at those, I really want you to think about how could these images be used in a therapeutic setting, and then I'll explain how they can. So, our first composer is named Toru Takamitsu. He was born in Tokyo, Japan in 1930, and he passed away in February of 1996. This right here is called Study for Vibration. It was composed in 1962, and you can see that we are given just a little bit of instruction here on the side. He says, possibly slow tempo, play on strings, and he's giving us these examples of what his visuals mean. We don't usually see that. So I'm going to show you an interpretation, one of the possible interpretations of this piece. So looking back at the score, can you kind of see what her thought process was while playing it? I know you only saw a little bit. It's very hard. It's hard to see exactly how she got what she did. That's why I think visual scores are amazing. They can be interpreted a million different ways. Every performer will perform them different. They will see something different. They'll feel something different by them. They're so versatile in that way. I think that's amazing. This particular performance was done by a woman named Miriam Wazer, and I think hers was my favorite interpretation I saw, mainly because she used very non-traditional ways of creating the music. She wasn't using a piano as you should, right? I think that is so cool, and I think Toru Takamitsu himself would really appreciate her interpretation that way. I think that is very cool. So given this little bit of instruction, it's very hard to see how it would all go together. That's why you go basically on how it makes you feel. So let me show you this next one by a man named John Cage. He was born in September of 1912 and died in 1992. This is one of my favorite visual scores because, well, look at it. What is it? What is going on here? Who knows? It's very eccentric. There is so much going on. I think this is the best score to look at and think, this is meaningless. What would you do with it? But a musician and a psychologist could do a lot with it. So I will show you now an interpretation of John Cage's Fontana Mix. Interesting, right? I think it's super cool how it almost sounds like a swarm of bees mixed with some metallic, maybe grinding or clanging. I think it's super cool. Again, a very non-traditional way to create music. This was created by Simon Raynell, and it was mixed by Dominic Lash. And I think it's a great interpretation as well, especially because once you hear it, I think looking at it, you can really see, okay, maybe the squiggles, very technical term. The squiggles, maybe that's the swarming noise, maybe the bees. And the metallic noise maybe is that big grid, maybe. Can be interpreted however you want. But it's very cool to see how different people interpret them. I think specifically this piece, from a therapist's point of view, could show maybe that the person is overwhelmed. Maybe they're anxious. Maybe there's a lot going on in their life. And this is how they're showing it. It would make sense to me. There's a lot going on. There's so many different shapes. But you could also say maybe they're all moving forward. The line straight down the middle is moving forward. The squiggles are all moving to one direction. Even the big grid is moving upwards. You could say it's maybe moving in a new direction or moving forward in life. Again, lots of different ways you can interpret it. Our next guy is Morton Feldman. He was born in 1926 and he passed away in 1986. This is projection 1, and he did specify that it was written for solo cello and it was composed in 1950. This one specifically is a very favorite one among music psychologists and music therapists because it does not look like a score whatsoever. It doesn't even really look like art. It looks like maybe a building plan. I think that's really interesting. But usually when we see this score played, it's interpreted as maybe sci-fi, more ahead of its time, maybe advanced. It sounds like it belongs in Star Trek or Star Wars, one of the two. So here's an example of this specific score. Again, beautiful. I love his interpretation. You can kind of see, he kind of agrees. I think it's not as space age as you would think, but I think it's very non-traditional as well. I think he really interpreted it as a dance between the long bow strokes and the short plucks. I think that's what he saw. Maybe the big boxes are the long strokes and the little boxes are the plucks. Or it could be the other way around. I wonder what he interpreted the letters as. It's really cool to think about. This performer's name was Giorgio Casati, and I think he did a beautiful job. Our next composer is Cornelius Cardew. Cornelius was born in 1936, and he passed away in 1981. And these are a few examples of his scores. These are from a collection of scores called treaties, and these were composed between 1963 and 1967. Treaties is a collection of 193 very abstract scores. Like I said, these are only a couple, and all of them look as crazy as this, I promise. I really, really like how you can see a sort of theme throughout his work. He uses lots of bubbles, like here we see these. It's also interesting he includes what looks like a traditional staff. In this one too, we can see bubbles and these lines, and again, possibly staves. It's very interesting. So I'm going to show an example of just one of these scores. And this is my best and favorite video so far, because as you'll see, it will show you how the music's being played pretty much measure to measure, which will help you further understand how exactly the performer is interpreting what they see. Isn't that so interesting? I really love that. I really love that you can see exactly where the performer thinks the beat is and where the performer thinks they're moving notes. Super cool. So these are some visual scores. I would also like to talk about Ludwig von Beethoven. He was very, very interested in what it looks like breaking from the norm. We can see here in his piano sonata, this is number 32, opus 111, a lot of these marks aren't traditional. They almost look like scribbles. They're off the staves. They're not quite on the staves. They're very hard to read for a normal musician, and this can be because it is older, but I believe it shows signs that Beethoven himself was trying to break free of the restrictions that he was given in traditional notation. And I think that is extremely interesting, that we see it as far back as Beethoven, that possibly they want something more out of music. So I highly encourage you to look into more visual scores. They're amazing. I think it's so amazing to see different performances of the same score. It's awesome to see different scores created by the same composer and the different paths they took for each score. It's so amazing. So now, I'm sure you're thinking, well, how can these be implemented in therapy? How could these be used for therapy? That doesn't make a lot of sense. Let me tell you. I believe, and a lot of other music psychologists believe, that graphic scores and graphic notation can provide a music therapist with a visual note-taking strategy that is faster and more effective than writing traditional notes. You can easily track a patient's mood over a session and show how it evolved, and that will give you a quick overview of how the session went. It is very quick, it is very effective, and it really helps music psychologists and music therapists because our sessions can go so quickly because music happens so quickly. It does not wait for anyone. So, I also believe that having patients compose their own scores could give the psychologist or the psychiatrist a glimpse into exactly how that patient is feeling. I think that it can be used wonderfully if you are teaching your patients that this can be done outside of therapy. They could begin to use it as a note-taking strategy for themselves or a journaling strategy. And that will give them a new healthy coping mechanism that they can continue to use their whole life. So I have some examples of some graphic notes that are done by actual therapists that I think will help you visualize exactly how they can be used. So this first one shows that, I should probably preface, these are all the same client, same music therapist, just different sessions. So in this first session, they decided to just go with kind of an overview. And we see that the patient runs into the room and they begin loudly drumming. And then slowly they start to relax and sit down with the bells and play with the bells. And then they leave the room quietly. That says a lot to a therapist. That child just came into the room very abruptly, very loud, with a lot of energy. And throughout the course of the session, they calmed themselves and they relaxed and they leave the room quietly. It is very nice to be able to see that super easily, very quickly with these notes. In session 4, we see a different kind of strategy used here. These different symbols are showing different instruments, and specifically, the therapist comes up with these on their own. So again, we see lively drumming and high notes on the piano, dominant chords in the bell shaker, xylophone notes fading out. That can tell us a lot. In the bottom one, we can see this one is specifically a timeline. And we can see minute by minute how the session went with the therapist, which can be very difficult if you are writing it all out, word by word. Sometimes music therapists will use a key, and keys are super helpful because you can have all of your symbols that you are using throughout your entire practice, and you can have them in one place. So then throughout your practice, you can keep taking notes and just jotting away. And if you need to, you can reference your key. A lot of music therapists use this style because it's easiest, it's fast, the keys are very easy. Here's a couple more examples. So there are typically 3 approaches to making graphic notation notes for therapists. This first one, number 1, is called a stenographic approach. So stenographic basically means a flow of consciousness. You just let whatever's happening happen. So here we see that the therapist is just, as the session, as it's happening, the therapist is jotting down notes. So this one specifically is documenting a woman's voice. And we see as she gets up, that's higher pitch and down. We could maybe interpret the swoopy lines as maybe legato, and the shorter lines maybe a little more staccato, or maybe even quieter. So this is called a stenographic approach, and it is most commonly used because it is very quick. It's just a flow of consciousness. Whatever you're thinking of gets written on the page, which is very useful because you may write things that you wouldn't think to write if you thought about them for a second. Number 2 is one of my favorites. Could you maybe tell what they're trying to portray by number 2? I think maybe excitement, agitation, maybe anger, maybe stress, maybe anxiety. It could be a lot of things. This is another type of key. This third one's another type of key. It's going to be very useful for the therapist. We can see that they even have specific drawings for when something is a harder noise or a softer noise. I like the snake. That's their melody. Harmonica. We see they have something else for soft or hard. And all of these are used by the therapist so that they could just quickly jot down their notes and not have to think a second thought about it. Ultimately, this will help the therapist better track their sessions, keep better notes of their sessions, be able to look back on these notes in a more effective way. It will help them better treat their patients. It is also known that specifically art-based therapies sometimes have a problem remaining clinical with the patient. Sometimes therapists will get too attached or too close with the patient. So the implementation of this visual note-taking can help to make that break. It can help not get so close. You aren't journaling to yourself in your notes about how your client makes you feel. You're simply writing notes about how their session is going, which really helps you decrease bias and blind spots that you could have. Furthermore, like I said, I think having these patients compose their own scores can be so beneficial. However, as we know, they can be interpreted a million different ways. This is why it's so important to, as a therapist, stop and have your patient explain to you what's going on in their score. Why did they use the tools they did? Why did they use the colors they did? Why did they use the shapes? Maybe, why is there so much? Why is there so little? That's why you need to have the discussion with them, which also helps them look over it again and rethink what they were thinking, what they were feeling, and this can help them manage their emotions and learn how to see those emotions and validate them for themselves instead of pushing them aside or bottling them up. Some scores we can just look at, especially patient scores. For example, in Mozart's Requiem, we see that it is frequently portrayed as sad or somber. Why is this? The descending notes, the very sad tone quality, dramatic intonation. A patient's score could show signs of the same. with maybe lots of descending shapes, maybe shapes going from big sizes to small sizes. Maybe there, again, is a ton going on, or maybe there's very little going on. Sometimes we can pull things from these scores that our patients aren't telling us, or that they don't even know is happening, which is why studying these scores and studying the different ways that they are perceived is very beneficial for music therapists. Another part that makes it so accessible is your clients don't need any knowledge of music theory at all. They don't need to know solfege. They don't need to know any of it to be able to compose their own visual scores, because it's art. You're just having fun with it. It's amazing. It just further shows the accessibility of music therapy itself. So I think that music therapy is so unique, and it is so beneficial to so many people. It's so accessible. It can be performed in any setting. It can be a super important factor in somebody's everyday life because they aren't stressed week to week. Oh, I have a therapy appointment. I get to go listen to some music, and I get to learn how to be myself. It's so nice to improve all of these different areas of a person's life, again, just by having fun with some music. So much research has been done regarding music therapy, and it's shown so many positive ways that it affects both patients and their families. And graphic scores specifically have been part of our history for hundreds of years. They really introduce a unique and fun way for people who don't know how to compose music, or people who've been composing music forever and are bored of it, if that happens. It gives them something new to do. It gives them a new way to express different emotions. Thank you again for spending your evening with me, and I'm glad to take any questions you may have now. Yes? No, I did not. I did not specifically research the composers themselves, but many of the scores that I looked at, and it was so hard choosing specifically what I wanted to do. But finding scores that the composers were still alive was very difficult, and most of the recordings I could find on YouTube were very poor quality. A lot of them are not professional, just because graphic scores are not very well known or talked about much. Thank you. Yes? Yes, before there has. No, I didn't specifically intend to include that, because I think for this purpose specifically, I wanted to show how other people were interpreting scores, especially because I did want to talk about how, as a therapist, you should be talking to your own patient about their specific scores. But I did not research specifically the composers and their own. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Um, what I mean by easy specifically is accessible. I think anyone can do it. Anyone can create a score, firstly. I think because it is basically just drawing how you feel. And I think with any basic music knowledge, you could look at even just a piece of art that's not a graphic score and create a song out of it. Yeah, I think, especially in an environment with a music therapist, the music therapist could even give some degree of instruction or explanation, maybe. You know, this is how I would do it, and maybe show them how to interpret. Yes, yes. No, I think for sure that was something I could have addressed on an alternative as well. And I think I will do some research into that for sure. Thank you. Yes. Mhm. 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 Yes. So you said how widespread? Are you talking about music therapy or graphic scores? It is not super common, especially my example of having a patient compose their own graphic scores. That is my thought, that is my hypothesis that I think they can be beneficial for the patient specifically. But the only specific research that I have found has been by Carl Bergstrom Nielsen, and there's a couple other, Dr. Olson. They talk about the graphic note taking for therapists. So it is pretty widespread, I'd say, as in music therapists, a lot of them use the visual note taking, but specifically using it for a patient is my thought and something that I wanted to elaborate on. Thank you. Anything else? Yes. Yes, yes, no, absolutely. I think I would definitely show them some examples of maybe some of the ones I showed you, maybe show them some examples of other performers performing them, maybe even find a couple of your own favorites and perform them for them, or even composing them, like composing your own alongside your patient could help. I think you could give them an example of maybe if you use a key like this one in your own practice, you could show them your key and say, you know, these blue bubbles mean bass notes. And you don't have to use blue bubbles for bass notes. You can use whatever you want, you know? And I think in that way, it's pretty easy. You show them, you know, you pick some shapes, you pick some styles, and you go with it, and then you tell me how it's gonna sound. Thank you. Yes, they could play it for you, or they could just discuss with you what it means. And for example, that's a great question. For my purposes, I believe that you could have a patient compose their own score and say they are very anxious and they're very stressed with their daily life. So they compose a score and it's very messy. There's a lot going on. It's very full. And then they explain to you why they used a bunch of things and there's a lot of moving parts. And, you ask them, well, how does this make you feel? And how did you feel while you were creating this? And that helps them look at their own emotions and think, oh, yes, I am anxious. And then that's where you take it from there and you find coping mechanisms. We find the root of the problem and we treat the patient. Yes. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. I would always keep them on file as a therapist, definitely. Always, as any type of therapist, revisiting notes, old sessions, or old things that your client has created is wonderful. Not only to show the evolution, but to also get a new perspective. They can look back on their life and say, wow, I was very sad in this situation, but I did this and this and this, and I helped myself get better, So absolutely. Any more? Mm-hmm. Absolutely, I agree. Yes, thank you. Anyone else? Yes. Absolutely. Yes. That was something I did want to expand on, but for lack of time, I had cut out. Yes, absolutely. I think individuals who are nonverbal or, even individuals that are hard of hearing or there's so many, I think definitely that could absolutely help them. Because again, they're not writing out their feelings and there's no need for them to talk. It's just compose your score and you can play it for me. And it's easy. So absolutely, I agree. That's a very good implementation. Any more? Mm-hmm. Yes, as well. Yes. I didn't specifically talk about that just because I did talk a little bit about who music therapy benefits specifically, but I didn't really want to talk about, I don't want to say negative, but I didn't want to talk negatively about music therapy in that way. But definitely, if you have sensitivities to noise or problems like that, music therapy is probably not the best option. But if you do have a passion for music therapy and you still have those sensitivities, there are still much quieter instruments. A lot of instruments, especially electronic ones, can be turned down a lot. there are just some more naturally quiet instruments. I think there are a lot of different accommodations that could be made. Yes, no, absolutely, yes. Yes. Absolutely. I did not research that at all in my topic, but definitely I think so. I think that would be wonderful, but I would have to research that some more. That is a very good question. Any more? Please join us for cookies and punch. We also have some fruit just right out in the lobby. Thank you, guys.